Let's look at the basics of the purchasing and inbound inventory processes. First part is to enter a purchase order. I've got a shortcut to a purchase order on my desktop, so I'm launching that. I can, as usual, in Priority, select my vendor through a search. I'm just going to drop a general vendor in there. And aside from if I need to change the default date of today's date, really all I need to do is enter part numbers. With the usual drop downs and searches, in this case, I'm just going to put a couple of items on here. The system will tell me that this isn't the normal vendor for these parts, but I'm not really very worried about that. I am choosing to buy from this vendor anyway. And having done that, I need to record the quantity that we're actually ordering. And you may notice that the system keeps prompting me as to whether I want to enter a due date. It's entirely optional if I do so or not. And that's all I need in order to produce the purchase order. At this point, I might well want to print this to screen or to email. If it's going to email, then it's clearly going to my vendor directly. As with every other transaction in Priority, remember the statuses in purchase orders, and this entirely turns on how you have configured the BPM, in other words, the flow charting. You may have a simple process which is defaulting to a final purchase order which can instantly be issued. You may have a number of processes with steps between them. If you are allowed to put it into a status that is in effect final, then doing so will enable us to proceed to the next step and actually receive these goods. Okay, we've issued the purchase order now and finalized it. So now what we want to do is receive the goods. Go into goods receiving, and in this case what we want to do is put in the vendor number, which you may recall is our general vendor. By putting in the general vendor, a number of things default into this goods receipt, most particularly that we're receiving them on today's date. Be careful with the dates, but it should be the date the goods were actually received if you want your costing to be correct. It's going to default into our main warehouse, but of course you can override that. And then if we look in the references tile under order number, this will display all of the open purchase orders available to be goods receipted. And we're going to start by receiving the purchase order that we were working on a moment ago. So when you put that purchase order number in, you will notice that the received items subform gives you the quantities that were actually ordered, and all you need to do at this point is record the quantity that was actually received, which may be the numbers that were ordered or could be any other quantity that you care to come up with. And at its heart, that's all you need to do in order to receive these goods. In this case, we want to go back up into the main form and remember that we'll have a status of draft on these goods receipts, on this goods receipt. So in order to complete the goods receipt, we want to record this as final, and that is completed booking the goods into inventory. If, on the other hand, you want to do a goods receipt that relates to multiple purchase orders, then similar kind of process. So we need to go into the goods receiving vouchers, we need to define the vendor number as before, but in this case we don't define the order number, we go straight to the purchase orders for GRV subform, and we define here the multiple orders that we're looking at. So if we take the two that we've been involved in, by recording both of them here rather than one in at the top of the form, the result of that is if we go to the received items, it will be showing all of the items from that purchase order, from those purchase orders, and just as we did before, we can define quantities for the amounts actually received. And that's all there is to it on the receipting process. Remember again that we will more than likely want to set the status to final in order to book them into inventory. When you receive a payable from a vendor, simply go to Financials and follow the accounts payable through the Vendor Invoices option. There are two that you'll be using frequently here. The vendor invoices is when you have not had any kind of inventory. So this would be invoices for things like legal fees, marketing, and utilities. But assuming that we've actually received inventory, then we want to identify that inventory and the originating purchase order as invoiced. So you use the multi-GRV feature. From the multi-GRV invoice form, you can specify the vendor that we're talking about and today's date and the vendor invoice number. And then having set the vendor, you can see all of those goods receipts that remain unbilled, and you can choose one. By choosing it, you will get all of the invoice items from that goods receipt listed, and the invoice assumes that it's billing for the total that has been received. So in most cases, that will actually complete the invoice process. You would then change the status to a ready status, and there's one further complication in the payable side, which is that you need to use a direct activation to complete the invoice and actually post it. So in order to move this payable through to being in the accounts, the first part is we need to approve it. Of course, this could be a genuine approval. I'm just going to mark it as approved. And then the final part is that the posting needs to be made, and that is done with finalizing, which can include actually printing at the same time. I'm simply going to finalize in this case. And so now the invoice has been finalized. The other side of this is what happens if you want multiple goods receipts on the same payable, which we'll look at next. So what we're going to do is we're going to record a payable, but in this case we're going to pick up multiple goods receipts against that invoice. So if we pick up the vendor details as previously, and it's a very, very similar process to the goods receipting process. Instead of recording a goods receipt number in the document number field at the top, we need to select goods receipts, GRVs, for the invoice and actually pick up from the open options that are here, and we can mark one or more of them directly into the payable. And what this process will do is it will bring in the rows into the invoice items. So then if we wanted to delete any individually, we could mark the row and simply get rid of the row, and then we're good to go in relation to the payable. And from here on, it's the same. We would change the status from draft to approved and finalize the payable.